Welcome back to this month's Composer Spotlight on Johann Sebastian Bach. In 1721, amidst the rest of the composing that Bach had to do as part of his job, the Brandenburg Concertos were finished. In case we're confused, a concerto is a piece of music with the main line written for a solo instrument, and this solo instrument is usually accompanied by the orchestra or a piano. So these Brandenburg Concertos are a collection of 6 instrumental works that Bach presented to the Margrave of Brandenburg-Schwedt. The manuscripts for the Brandenburg Concertos weren't even published until 1849 and were almost lost in World War II. But it's lucky that they were saved, because these compositions are widely regarded as some of the best orchestral compositions of the Baroque era. So I highly recommend listening to those. In the same year that these were finished, Bach remarried since his first wife had died from disease. His second wife's name was Anna Magdalena, and she had been a singer at the court Bach was working at as director of music. She's the reason for the famous Notebook for Anna Magdalena, which is a collection of 2 manuscript notebooks full of music that he presented to her as a gift. Later on, he also published some more of his keyboard and organ music. One important collection of these works is the Well-Tempered Clavier. It comprises 2 books, each of which presents a prelude and fugue for solo keyboard in every major and minor key, adding up to 24 keys. So I was always confused by the name the Well-Tempered Clavier because I thought well-tempered meant good-natured, and I thought clavier was some kind of profession, like a blacksmith. So I thought it meant something like the good-natured blacksmith. However, in Bach's time, clavier was the word they used for any keyboard instrument. They didn't have pianos back then, so it would have been referring to a harpsichord or clavichord, and possibly an organ. If you're not sure what a harpsichord is, it was basically the older version of the piano. It had a main body standing on legs, just like a piano, but when you hit a key on the harpsichord, instead of hammering on the strings, it would pluck the strings. So as you can imagine, it would be impossible to play really softly on a harpsichord or really loudly, because every time you press the key, the note would always be plucked the same way. That's probably why we don't see many dynamic markings for Bach's works, at least in piano music, because back then they would have been written for harpsichord. And as for the other part about the name, back then, well-tempered meant that it was tuned in a way that you'd be able to play in all 24 major and minor keys, and the harpsichord or clavier wouldn't sound out of tune. After his time in Cothen, Bach went to Leipzig and became director of church music. At this point in his life, he was supplying music for 4 churches as well as a university. The total number of cantatas produced during this year was about 62, of which about 39 were new works. Some scholars estimate Bach was writing as much as a cantata a week at times during his years composing for these churches. One of these works included Jesu Joy of Man's Desiring, which was a church cantata meant to be performed during a service. This piece uses hymn text about having a close personal relationship with Jesus. I highly suggest listening to this piece, which is part of the reason that Bach has become one of my favorite composers. It is one of the most beautiful pieces I've ever heard. You can listen to the original version for choir, and I also suggest listening to Celtic Women's version of the piece. That's all for this week. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.